Hello, in this video, I want to talk about a little bit of something different than what I think would follow the line of a lot of the other videos that I've made talking about critical debate and the normal videos in the resolution, because I think a lot of the videos that I make are me trying to figure out what are the most predictable arguments that people are going to make. But in this video, I really kind of want to do a lot more of actually kind of like arguing in favor for, or really talking about the expansive use of a particular argument that I think people might be asleep on when it comes to the intellectual property protections resolution. And I think that it's really important to as an angle to think about if you are looking in the area of Black studies or wondering what types of arguments for Black studies could be coming forward in the area of intellectual property protections, and that's understanding Moten and intellectual property protections. I actually, the more that I've thought about it, have found a lot of niche interactions between Moten and a lot of the things that people are talking about intellectual property protections, and a lot of the central criticisms that I think both fit the question of like what intellectual property is as a political, symbolic, and cultural thing, and I think that there's also a way to think about the possibility of using Moten to critique the kind of like international WTO model of like how these things are being implemented and the way intellectual property protections become things that are used for colonial violence, and ways in which policy is able to kind of like expand various forms of control and governance that I think is really important to a lot of the writing that Moten is doing, both at an international scale and as a domestic scale, or at a scale of just thinking about like the past of like U.S. history and stuff like that. And so I think there are a lot of arguments that Moten is making that are pertinent to debate and that I think are really important here. I think that when I'm trying to figure out maybe what are some of the most like central arguments that really kind of like cross over into what are some of the places that Foucault uses the most, I think the first thing is that when you kind of just take what I think a lot of people are going to start this resolution with, which is the intellectual property protections portion of the resolution, a lot of the stuff that I think that critical teams really want to argue against is about why the kind of culture of intellectual property protections creates this kind of like assumption and monopoly over how we like patent things and like create new inventions and scientific discoveries that are based on being able to shine light on like white Western science, and is able to show like the white Western man is something that kind of like has this total knowledge to like save the world and like bring it into the future as like this kind of like grand savior of mankind. And so I think the arguments that Moten is kind of making not only about like the academy and arguments like the undercommons, but also arguments that he's making in those books about things like governance and the expansive control of things like policy outside of just like the strict confines of just the academy itself, which I think are really important and interesting for how you kind of engage this resolution as a whole. So the first thing I think is that there are so many good arguments that Moten and Harney are really making about the idea of total knowledge and the academy as a place of knowledge, and the academy as a place of like total welfare production. And I think there are really interesting ways to talk about how the kind of like form of intellectual property protection establishes like total knowledge. The idea of this fully realized kind of like medically enabled like scientist subject is like part of the ability to create cultural and political like symbolism around like the kind of like perpetuation of like this kind of like locus of total knowledge that exists. And I think that the thing that's interesting about that is that I think it expands further into the arguments that Moten and Harney start to then making in terms of the relationship that they're pushing between policy and planning, because their argument is that policy attempts to like portray itself as total, as the only option in front, and say that planning is some type of spectacle that is like outside of the ability to do the kind of like daily functionings of the institutions that we use from systems of governance. And so I think a lot of the arguments for like IPP is the way that it kind of like ontologized centers and kind of like makes infinite the process by which we kind of assume that not only that white Western science is the one that kind of holds the locus for like national well-being or international well-being, but also the way in which that kind of forwards into different types of logics of how we kind of like perpetuate our own understanding of like what that kind of total knowledge and governance means in terms of like where we put our trust, how that kind of like disables us from thinking about radical alternatives and dissuades us from being able to see the kind of like legitimate histories of violence that people are kind of like using in order to argue against the way in which the spirit of the topic is kind of like being drawn towards. I think that this kind of like also expands into the question of the WTO, because of the way in which the WTO isn't inclusive of like the entire globe, but is conclusive of nations that it deems relevant, as it deems as like necessary for international well-being, etc. And so a lot of the questions of like what it even means to be a member country and what particular powers those member countries have still fold themselves into a way that the U.S. is able to like basically, or Western modes of government are able to expand themselves by using coercive forces such as the WTO to force forms of like international modeling, so that there can be a mimicry of the way in which like Western governance seeks to like understand understand our relationship between like the economy and the way that we kind of like do and forward politics for like the general well-being of the world, etc. All of these things I think make really interesting and central arguments that can be really expansive on the affirmative and the negative, which is kind of where I kind of want to use the rest of this video to really talk about how these things can be broken down, their particular uses, before we get into like our normative series where I kind of like go a lot more in depth into like what these things look like in like specific contexts. And so when I think about like what are the main ways that like Moten and Harney can be used in the affirmative for this type of resolution, I think a lot about the ways in which the arguments, not just like for the undercommons, but like the way in which they kind of use the undercommons as a frame for sociality that expands beyond the reaches of just the academy, but rather the academy is kind of an example of a particular type of institution that the undercommons has a specific like historical relationship to, and the undercommons is kind of like always existent as the underside of like these various institutions. And I think it would be really interesting to see teams kind of like think about the way in which there's always an underside to this resolution as well, the underside to the WTO being the illicit economies that are deemed illegal because of the standards that are assigned by the WTO that still keep and fund itself intact and operate as places in which the WTO is able to extract resources to sustain its survival. Arguments about why like intellectual property protections as like a field requires a particular mode of how we think about study and our debt and credit relationship to study, i.e. patent laws and things as credit that kind of reestablishes like our relationship to medical debt. There are so many interesting ways I think that you can kind of push what an undercommons, or as Moten has called in like other pieces, an under-cosmopolitanism looks like to redefine how we think of not only questions of sovereignty but also how we think of questions of study in the face of sovereignty that I think are really like critical to how we think about medical innovation and the future of what like intellectual property protections as like a field looks like as we kind of like move forward to thinking about various types of like uses of intellectual property protections. I think then when you kind of like take that onto the negative, you have a lot of critiques of the way in which people can try to make even like I think like the softest left moves of trying to get closer to like getting rid of intellectual property protections that still don't really reveal the way in which they change like global sources of governance as a whole and only create like new vacuoles for the consumption of like the radical alternatives that like you could be producing from the alternative. I think the simple removal of intellectual property protections wouldn't be able to resolve a lot of the criticisms that we've kind of talked about that are central to the resolution that will apply to a lot of affirmatives, because that abolition of intellectual property protections as a whole doesn't still change the way in which international organizations such as the WTO, such as the state, can still take the kind of like productions of radical alternatives and introduce them as international practices to finance and to turn into capital, and actually like furthers like the privatization of such a field because of the way it's already kind of like basically pre-made and pre-related to questions of like capitalism, questions of colonial extraction, etc. And so I think there are a lot of uses and interesting ways to see these arguments kind of interact with the rest of the intellectual property protections resolution. And I definitely think that's a place that I would kind of think of as we're kind of thinking about what are the bounds for what this conversation is going to look like for the rest of these videos. Hopefully you enjoy it, and hopefully you'll be able to kind of take this into the way that you're thinking about intellectual property protections and the LD resolution upcoming for September and October. And yeah, thank you.